Is it common for Japanese people to pretend not to understand foreigners when they speak Japanese? I hear a lot of stories about Japanese people, mostly waiters and waitresses, pretending not understand foreigners even if they speak Japanese well enough. Situations like I had to use Google Translator and pretend I don't know Japanese, or I had to make my Asian-looking friend who doesn't know the language speak on my behalf. Now I know Japan is an ethnically and probably culturally homogenized society, but feigning ignorance when a foreigner speaking the same language sounds childish and disrespectful. I've had a couple of occasions where I speak Japanese and it seems like something has broken in their brain. Like I'm suddenly speaking Korean or using interpretive dance to communicate or something. Not particularly common, but I've heard it happen to a few other foreigners. I don't think they are doing it on purpose. I'm an Australian that went to America for a few months. Was floored by how many people had difficulty understanding what I was saying. We were all speaking English. I've heard the same rumor that you've mentioned about Asian countries pretending not to understand you unless you get the words perfect. But after my experience, I think it's just PPL genuinely not understanding the different accents. It may be the accent. I once had to translate English to English for some people and it felt pretty odd. We had an Asian consultant with what I thought was a mild accent. We were doing work up in one of our mines in a smaller town. A bit remote. Assume it was due to not many people up there with accents, but the two other people in the meeting, Canadian-born, kept on asking me to translate the consultant's English from time to time. And I would go, he said. Won't forget it, as I felt bad for the consultant by repeating, summarizing his sentences periodically through the meeting. Yes, it is very common. If a non-English speaker mispronounces a few words or uses incorrect grammar, we can usually figure out the meaning or intent of what they are trying to communicate quite easily. Some Japanese people seem unusually stubborn and pedantic and pretend that they don't understand foreigners who speak Japanese even when something is spoken only slightly incorrectly. It's mildly infuriating because you know they understand you, but they are just being taught. A lot of people learning Japanese overestimate their ability to speak in a way that monolingual native speakers can understand, in my experience. I'm sure there are people who pretend, but I suspect that more often than not, they genuinely don't understand. As a native speaker of English and someone who regularly doesn't understand people's English when it is also their native language, but it sounds slightly different from the way I speak English, I would cut them some slack and chalk it up to accents can be hard. I'd recommend asking the Japan or a Japan-related subreddit. Sometimes a foreign accent can really throw someone off. Learning native pronunciation is key. It's way more likely that they genuinely don't understand your accent than them pretending not to understand. I heard it happens because they are trying to be polite, and when your Japanese is broken, they may be scared to misunderstand you. That's one explanation I got. Outside of tourist areas, probably that's pretty common, though also it can be hard to understand accents if you aren't accustomed to them. Japan in many parts is filled with a lot of xenophobia, same as most rural places in heterogeneous countries. I've heard of this happening in different countries like France too. Could be an accent inflection issue. Or they could be anti-tourist and like to see you struggle. Just prepare and try your best. No, it's not true. The worst thing that may happen is that they want to practice their English or just switch by reflex. I recently moved to an area in Japan that has no tourists and very few other foreigners, if there are any at all. I got sick and my boyfriend took me to the hospital. He was sat behind me on his phone because it was busy and we couldn't sit next to each other. Anyway, the nurse saw me and without me even opening my mouth, she just blue screened and was standing in front of me like she was having a stroke. I still didn't say anything and was leaving her to suffer, but my boyfriend is much kinder than I am and jumped in to save her. Sometimes it's not you're Japanese. It's that you're not Japanese. My English boss has stories of French strangers refusing to understand his fluent French because of his English accent, when his French colleagues could understand him perfectly well. One of my friends has a story of the time he was in the US, and the server in the Kentucky sandwich shop refused to understand his request for tuna until his American host stepped in and explained that he meant tuna. Some people are just picky about accents. I've personally never had this happen to me. It may be more common in certain areas. For context, I live in Osaka that are more touristy, but I honestly have no idea why anyone would do this. Japan is an homogeneous place where their language is only spoken in their own country. They are probably used only to the native accent, and it may be hard to understand the pronunciation of a foreigner. English is very different since it's spoken in many countries with different pronunciations. Many people have it as second language too, so English speakers get their brains used to a lot of variations. Add to that grammar mistakes and the awkwardness of the moment. Have you ever listened to a Japanese who doesn't speak good English try to do it? It's also hard to understand. It's the accent usually. If you don't pronounce things the same way, one word could mean something totally different or just be gibberish. Happens to me sometimes when I visit and try to speak Japanese. But I have a few foreign friends who live and study there, and I've never seen anyone confused at their Japanese. It's not so much that they pretend. Most are very anxious about looking foolish if they speak incorrect English. It's one of the idiosyncrasies of Japanese culture. They take plenty of English through school but struggle with pronunciation. I mean, if you actually listen to someone speaking Japanese, their modern lexicon is filled with loan words that have been modified to fit Japanese pronunciation. It's mostly a phobia. There is an old story joke. An American soldier was in Korea during the war and was walking back to his unit at the local village. He stopped and asked two farmers in fluent Korean if this was the road that went to the village. The farmers looked at him like he was nuts. He walked on, but heard them saying, "Did you hear that?" It sounded like he was asking about the village. The other replied, "Don't be crazy, Americans can't speak Korean." I think it's just the surprise that a non-Asian person can speak their language that throws them. I think it's mainly because of two reasons. 1. Some foreigners have heavy accents, making it hard to understand. 2. Japanese people are typically more reserved. So even if they think they understand what you're saying, they don't want to misunderstand it and hence ask you to repeat what you said. I have been living in Japan for almost a decade now, and I have yet to encounter this issue. Even during my first year here, when my Japanese was around N5 level. In fact, my experience has been quite the opposite. The people here have all been very welcoming, kind, and friendly, and have gone above and beyond to understand and communicate with any friends or family of mine that have come to visit me and have traveled across Japan. So, in my experience and the experience of anyone who has visited me over the last few years, this isn't common at all. I think sometimes they're just not expecting you to speak it, so it messes with their head and stops them processing it. To be fair, my Wisconsin native wife often cannot understand what a predominantly from the South is saying. I have to interpret for her. Have you ever had trouble understanding someone with a Southern accent? And that's a native speaker.